Just to give you a little background, this is how, of course, how we were trained in the learning disabilities, and you may already be familiar with a lot of this. Way back in 1917, Hinshelwood looked at neurological dysfunctions in the brain, and particularly men who were coming back from World War I with brain damage. And he said, all of a sudden they couldn't read, they couldn't speak. They had the kind of disabilities that kids were showing in classrooms who also couldn't read. And so he looked at those brains, what was different. And of course, they didn't have brain imaging, so he could only do it through autopsy. But he found that the studies of their disabilities, when they lost it, many areas of the brain were still intact. But he said the damages were attributed to specific centers of the brain. So very, very beginnings of brain research. And then he studied kids who couldn't read, and he said they had congenital word blindness. So word blindness, he said, is inherited. Often he noticed it in families, which we know is true, and with LD it is something that's inherited. And that there was damage in the brain somewhere where letters and words were stored. So then Orton in 1937, he continued that research and developed an explanation for reading disabilities. And he's pretty famous for that and has also developed a good intervention program for it. He proposed that reading difficulties were caused by delay or failure in the establishment of dominance for language in the left hemisphere. He was actually on the right track, which is what we have found when they've done the MRIs. Although this kind of led to that belief that there's two sides of the brain, and I'm right brain and I'm left brain. And the more we look into how the brain functions, there really isn't a left brain or right brain. There's a lot of information that goes through the brain. But there are certain functions that tend to be located in some areas of the left side and some areas of the right. Although we've had anomalies where they've removed an entire hemisphere of the brain, for example, for students with epilepsy, they've taken that whole side of the brain out or cut the connection between the two so they couldn't communicate, and the other side of the brain will compensate and take over those functions. So the brain is amazing. It's amazing in how plastic it is, but they have found that it isn't. You're not a right brain person or a left brain person. You may be more artistic and may be more adept at some things, but we can't say, you really cannot give an assessment for someone who's left brain or right brain. There's no such thing. The remediation that came about because of Orton was that systematic and explicit instruction combined with intensive skill building practice using letter-sound relationships or phonics, which is what Orton is famous for. And he was on the right track. That's absolutely true, and that has been shown through many years of research to be very, very effective for kids who can't read. They need that intensive, explicit instruction. And you're gonna see later on that it does actually change the way the brain functions. He coined the term streptosymbolia for the twisted symbols that we see with kids where they twist the letters and they actually see them different. And he said, again, this was because the confusion between the two hemispheres. He said neither side was dominant, therefore there was confusion there. Then the remediation that came out from that again is that systematic explicit instruction, which we now know is true and really does work. But neither of the theories about neurological basis for reading disorders was widely disseminated in the scientific and educational circles. And so it really didn't gain popularity, which is too bad because it was very effective. His method was right on, and now we know it was right on. But back then in the 40s and 50s, schools attributed the problems of students who didn't read or couldn't do math and had learning disabilities to environmental problems, parental problems, attitude problems, and educational problems.